Have you ever noticed how some people can change your mind without you even realizing it? One conversation, and suddenly your opinion shifts. One message, and you feel convinced. There's no pressure, no argument, no force. Just a strange feeling that their idea somehow became your idea. The unsettling truth is, in many cases, that feeling was not accidental. It was engineered, carefully designed, tested in laboratories, political campaigns, and advertising agencies. What started as a simple psychological discovery eventually turned into something far more powerful, a method so effective that some experts began calling it a psychological weapon. And today, versions of this technique are used everywhere. In marketing, in politics, on social media, in our everyday conversations. The real question is not whether it exists. The real question is this: have you already been influenced by it today? Because persuasion, when used correctly, doesn't feel like persuasion. It feels like agreement. Think about that for a second. If someone argues aggressively with you, your brain activates defense mode. You resist. You push back. You protect your identity and your beliefs. But what if someone could bypass that defense entirely? What if they could guide your thinking instead of confronting it? That's exactly what this technique does. Instead of fighting your beliefs, it quietly reshapes the path your mind takes to reach a conclusion. The result, you arrive at the conclusion yourself, which means you defend it, as if it were your own idea. That's the power behind it. And once you understand how it works, you will start seeing it everywhere. The origin of this technique goes back decades. Psychologists studying human decision-making discovered something fascinating. Humans rarely make decisions using pure logic. Instead, we rely on shortcuts, mental patterns, emotional cues, social signals. Our brains are constantly searching for the easiest path to a conclusion. And if someone subtly controls that path, they can strongly influence where it leads. This insight changed everything. Suddenly, persuasion wasn't about arguments anymore. It became about psychology. The most powerful persuaders stopped trying to win debates. Instead, they started designing environments where people would persuade themselves. One famous experiment demonstrated this perfectly. Participants were asked simple questions about their opinions, harmless topics, nothing controversial. But the way the questions were structured changed everything. One group received neutral questions. The other group received questions that subtly guided their thinking. The difference was astonishing. People in the second group consistently shifted their opinions toward the direction suggested by the questions. No commands, no arguments, just carefully designed wording. Their minds filled in the rest. This discovery opened the door to one of the most powerful persuasion strategies ever identified. The technique is simple in appearance, but extremely sophisticated in practice. It works by triggering what psychologists call cognitive momentum. Once the brain begins moving in a certain direction, it prefers to keep going. It feels natural, comfortable, consistent, and the person experiencing it rarely notices the shift happening. Instead, they feel like they are simply following their own reasoning. Here's where it becomes truly fascinating. Humans have a deep psychological need to be consistent with their previous thoughts and actions. Once we say something, we feel pressure to act in alignment with it. Once we agree with a small idea, we become more likely to accept a bigger version of that idea later. This is known as the commitment principle, and it's one of the core engines behind the persuasion technique we're discussing today. Imagine someone asks you a harmless question, something easy to agree with. You answer yes. Then they ask another question that slightly extends the first idea. Again, you agree. Step by step, the path continues. Each agreement feels small, logical, natural, but eventually you reach a conclusion that you might have rejected if it had been presented directly at the beginning. Yet now, it feels consistent with everything you just said. This strategy has been used in sales for decades, but its influence goes far beyond business. Political campaigns have used it to shape public opinion. Social movements have used it to mobilize large groups of people. Online platforms unknowingly amplify it through algorithms that gradually expose users to increasingly aligned viewpoints. Over time, the brain adapts to the direction of the information flow, and the person experiencing it believes they simply discovered the truth. Now think about social media for a moment. You watch one video about a topic, then another, then another. Each one pushes the idea slightly further than the previous one. The progression feels smooth, natural, logical, but step back and look at the bigger picture. You may have traveled a very long psychological distance from where you started. That is cognitive momentum in action. Advertisers understand this extremely well. Instead of immediately asking you to buy something, they first create agreement. They show a problem you recognize. Then they describe a frustration you've experienced. Then they highlight a desire you already have. By the time the product appears, your brain has already built a mental bridge toward it. Buying feels less like persuasion and more like a natural next step. The most powerful part of this method is its invisibility. The person being influenced rarely feels manipulated. In fact, they often feel empowered. After all, they reach the conclusion themselves. That sense of ownership makes the belief stronger and harder to challenge. If someone later questions it, the brain reacts defensively, because now it's not just an idea. It's part of their identity. This is why experts sometimes refer to the technique as a psychological weapon, not because it forces people to do things against their will, but because it reshapes how their will forms in the first place. Instead of controlling behavior directly, it influences the process that creates the behavior. And once someone understands this process deeply, they can design conversations, messages, and environments that guide thinking with remarkable precision. For example, skilled communicators often avoid direct statements. Instead, they ask questions. Not random questions, strategic ones. Questions that activate certain thoughts while ignoring others. Questions that move the brain step by step toward a particular conclusion. When you answer a question, your brain searches internally for reasons, evidence, and justification. The moment you produce that reasoning yourself, the idea becomes far more convincing, because it didn't come from someone else. It came from you. This is why great persuaders often sound curious rather than assertive. They appear to explore ideas rather than impose them. But in reality, the path of the conversation was carefully planned from the beginning. The power of this technique becomes even stronger when combined with social proof. Humans instinctively look to others to determine what is normal or correct. If we believe many people agree with an idea, our resistance drops dramatically. Suddenly the idea feels safer, more credible, more acceptable. So, persuasive systems often show evidence of popularity, testimonials, large numbers, viral trends, massive audiences. Each signal tells your brain the same thing. Other people believe this, and once that signal appears, the path toward agreement becomes even smoother. Authority also plays a role. If the message appears to come from an expert, a respected figure, or a trusted institution, the brain reduces skepticism even further. The idea gains credibility before it is even examined. Combine cognitive momentum, commitment, social proof, and authority, and you create a persuasion system that is extremely difficult to resist. This is why some governments study these methods carefully. Communication shapes public behavior, and public behavior shapes society itself. The ability to influence beliefs at scale can change elections, markets, and cultural norms. But here's the part most people never realize. These techniques are not only used by powerful institutions, they appear in everyday life, in friendships, in negotiations, in dating, in job interviews, in family conversations. Every time someone guides you through a sequence of small agreements, they may be using a version of this method, and once you become aware of it, something interesting happens. You start noticing patterns. Certain questions suddenly feel strategic. Certain conversations reveal a hidden structure. You realize that persuasion is rarely spontaneous. It is often engineered. However, understanding persuasion is not just about protecting yourself. It's also about communication. The most effective communicators in the world use these principles not to manipulate people, but to make ideas easier to understand and accept. Think about teachers. For example, great teachers rarely start with the final answer. They guide students through a sequence of insights. Each step prepares the brain for the next one. Eventually, the student reaches the conclusion and experiences a powerful moment of realization. That moment feels satisfying because the mind participated in building the idea. This same principle appears in storytelling. A powerful story gradually shapes how the audience feels about characters and events. By the time the final message appears, the emotional groundwork has already been laid. The audience doesn't feel forced to believe the message. They feel like they discovered it naturally. That is the essence of this persuasion technique. Guide the journey, don't force the destination. But here's the warning many psychologists emphasize. The more subtle a persuasion method becomes, the easier it is to misuse. When influence happens invisibly, ethical boundaries become extremely important because persuasion can educate, it can inspire, it can motivate positive change, but it can also manipulate. And the difference often depends on intention. This is why awareness matters so much. When you understand the mechanisms behind influence, you gain something powerful. Choice, the ability to pause, to analyze, to question the path your mind is taking. Instead of automatically following cognitive momentum, you can step back and ask yourself one simple question. Why do I believe this? If the answer is strong evidence and clear reasoning, then the belief is solid. But if the answer is simply a chain of small agreements that gradually pushed you toward a conclusion, then maybe it's worth examining again. The most powerful defense against psychological influence is not resistance, it's awareness. And the moment you start seeing persuasion patterns around you, you begin to realize something surprising. Influence is everywhere. In headlines, in advertisements, in viral videos, in political speeches, in everyday conversations. The real difference between people who are constantly influenced and those who remain mentally independent is not intelligence. It's awareness of the system. Because once you see the system, the invisible becomes visible. And when that happens, persuasion stops being mysterious. It becomes understandable, predictable, and sometimes even obvious. So the next time you feel your opinion shifting during a conversation, pause for a moment. Ask yourself what path your mind just traveled. Who asked the questions? What agreements happened along the way? What emotional signals appeared? And most importantly, where was that path leading you? Because the most powerful persuasion technique in the world doesn't control what you think. It guides how you arrive there. And now that you understand it, you'll start seeing it everywhere. Thanks for watching. If this video made you think, consider subscribing for more content that explores the hidden patterns of our world. See you next time.